Papalaboards will show you some tips and tricks for painting black properly, so you can paint black the right way. Why is this the right way? Because I told you so. Let's see how Papalaboards paints black. Jesus Christ, guys, it's the clothes. When we are painting black, it's easy to start with an already black miniature. Like almost all my minis, I primed it with Vallejo's Meha Primer Black. Now this primer has a satin finish which can be beneficial and annoying at the same time. When we start to sketch our first highlights on the area that we like to paint as black, a thin layer of wet paint and the satin primer can look very similar. So either you can use a coat of matte varnish or angle your mini in a way so you see less of those reflections. The beneficial part of the satin finish is that usually leather coats and boots have a shiny surface as well. So if we can keep some of that shiny finish, it can make our black coat look more interesting, and a satin or glossy finish could also make the black tones appear darker by adding some depth to them. As you see, I'm sketching my first highlight layer and I'm using this neutral dark gray. I bet you guys try to use some grays when you highlight a black surface, but most of the time you get this cold feel to them because after a while these highlights turn out to be blue. I don't want that right now. So I mix a relatively warmer coral to my black to have a more neutral gray value. Any yellow, ochre or pale orange could work here in a similar way because the black paint will desaturate your paint, so it will become more gray with this ratio. The key thing at this step is the ratio of your highlights compared to the black surfaces. You leave around 40 to 50% of your black surface totally black. I will repeat this thing a couple of times, but guys, this is super important. If you highlight more than the half of the mini, your mid-tone is going to change to the value you use to highlight. If that happens, I will slap on your tiny hand. Now I talked about the bluish-gray highlights on black, so I'm using the character card as a reference. And like most of the illustrations for the characters, this one has a cold blue fill light over the silhouette of the hero. Papalaboards is a sucker for this. Now in a two-dimensional world, like this illustration, these fill lights are pretty easy to do, but we have a three-dimensional sculpt, so it's going to be a little bit more tricky, but don't worry, Papalaboards will hold your hand throughout the process and slap on it if you don't listen to me. So previously we sketched this neutral gray over the lower half of the mini, and now we are going to paint these blue highlights like there is a blue light source coming from above the character, and we direct it in a way that it's also coming or angled to the left. So from a top left angle, we need to align this with our money shot. This is our money shot, and this is how this effect should look like when it's done. Okay, so while I'm painting these highlights, I'm always checking this angle back to back. We need a very solid foundation for this, otherwise we need to revise this angle over and over again. Now you might think, Papalaboards, I want to watch a video about how to paint back, but this is getting very complex with all these different light sources. Well, Papalaboards couldn't care less because it's going to look awesome and it's still going to look black, but only if you highlight around 40 to 50% of the surface. Now we have a blue-gray and a neutral gray highlight sketch over the character. I start to blend in these layers first with black using a thin layer consistency. Now I'm using stippling and layering to make these blends. When I'm stippling, I create small dots with my brush around the area I'd like to blend, and when I'm blending with layering or glazing, I move my brush from my highlight areas to the black parts and creating smaller and smaller layers upon each other. Since we are using a thin consistency, multiple layers of paint will create a gradient that should be the most opaque in the black areas. This is also a great time to reduce your highlight areas if you feel like what you are painting is reading as gray already. There is a foolproof method to see if what you are painting is getting more gray than black. First, look at the mini and ask yourself, does this look black? If your answer without hesitation is yes, then I have good news. But if your answer is like, well, this part kinda looks black, wrong answer, so reduce the gray parts on that part. If you feel like there is something a little bit off with what you painted, Spoiler alert, it's probably off. Always look up and revise what you paint, or ask Papa Laborz to revise it for you on Patreon. Now we continue with the blending with the other two mixtures we used for the highlights with the same stippling and layering technique while keeping the ratios of the volumes. It's perfectly fine if you guys need to go back with the black again, so your mid-tone will be on point. Papa Laborz does that also between the takes, but I'm creating a narrative for the tutorial where it's like a perfectly linear process. Make no mistake, it is not. I'm checking my ratios back and forth just like everyone else, okay? Okay. With stippling, you need to have a nice tip for your brush, so try to shape the tip on your knuckle with a pulling and rolling motion. Once you start applying these little dots, you can create very fine blends without any other blending method, but if you fancy some glazing, these little patterned surfaces will reduce your glazing time tremendously. The tricky part about placing the smallest of dots that you can dot is that I'm not really feeling when the brush is touching the surface. So I'm just looking for a visual feedback as they appear on the surface. So it's going to take a while to get the hang of it, and you can play with the consistency of the paint as well to thin your paint down and create multiple layers of stippling to make your blend smooth like Granny's butt cheek. I continue the highlight process on the blue parts of the coat. This time I only add this value inside my previous highlight layer that I made with the thunderhawk blue and black mixture. Make sure you see the difference between the neutral and blue-gray parts, because we will use that as a foundation for the rest of the process. It's very important that the blue and the neutral gray highlights won't bleed over each other. If you watch my highlight placement, there is always a completely black part between the two sections, because that is our darkest layer color. We need to keep this so the different light sources will be more defined. Of course, you can use just one tone for these highlights. You don't have to use this bluish and neutral gray, and it will look just as fine, but a little tonal variation and contrast could be way more interesting for our monkey brains than just one tone. We like to look at things that have more color. If you watch me painting this coat, your eyes probably start to wander more on the blue parts. There are two main reasons for that. One is the value, because the thunderhawk blue layer is higher in value than the neutral gray highlights. What I mean by that, it's brighter, basically. And the other one is saturation. Thunderhawk blue is more saturated compared to the other gray highlights at this point, so it has more presence on the mini, so you are probably looking at it more. Or maybe you are very interested in the boots, I don't know. I mix some verdigris to the thunderhawk blue to push the contrast on the blue highlight parts and continue the process. As I mentioned, I like these fill lights on the character art, so I keep checking the angle of my money shot to see if the silhouette effect is still working. It's challenging to make these smooth blends over these tiny surfaces, and basically we have to sacrifice some depth of these highlights in the process in some cases. What I mean by that is maybe we get rid of our second darkest layer on the parts that will have the maximum values on some of the more narrow folds of the coat. You can see I'm still keeping the ratio of my black layer, but the ratio of my highlight layers are changing. There are multiple reasons for that. One of these reasons is our focal point. I haven't painted the face yet, but I have to paint these highlights in a way that the face will be our focal point. So I add more volume to the shoulders and the upper back by also looking for this silhouette effect to work. It can be a lot at first, and if you are unsure about your highlight placement and the different light sources, I would advise that you only focus on the ratios of your values, so your mid-tone will read as black. Once you get the hang of that, you can try with the advanced stuff, but don't drown in these details if you are not there yet. It's totally fine. I I continue with the neutral gray highlights. It's the same stippling and layering approach with thin layers, and I build up these highlights gradually over time. When I get to the pants, I'm using this layer very moderately, because even though the character's whole attire is black, the fabric and texture is different. One way to communicate that is to have less contrast on a certain part. For example, the pants. I'm painting those like they are some cargo pants because they are tucked in his boots, and if they were leather pants, there is no way you tuck those in your boots because it's a fashion crime, and your farts could blow up your pants and it would make it look weird. So with less contrast on the pants, we can emphasize the fact it's made of a different material and has less reflective characteristics than the coat or the boots. According to this, I add more volume to the coat on these highlights over the arms and black area. With a grey mix that is slightly higher in value, I revised the highlights on the pants and the boots. I pushed the contrast a little bit on the pants, on some folds that face up. I highlight the pouches around the waist, but I don't need too much volume on them, since the character's coat is casting a shadow over these areas. I go back to the shoulders and arms to refine the highlights. If you follow the folds with your brushstrokes, you don't need some crazy blends. A well-placed highlight could always cut corners with the blending time. With ice yellow, I add some maximum highlights over the boots. So, since the character has this hunched over pose, the boots couldn't really get any of the blue highlights, so I use some yellow as a neutral highlight. It has a tiny bit of yellow, but because the value jump is quite steep, it almost reads as white. For the maximum value highlight on the cloak, I use verdigris, which reads as a much colder tone and fits nicely with this cold blue dim. As I mentioned previously, some layers will disappear under my recent highlights to keep our black mid-tone, and I'm still using a thin layer consistency. To make this silhouette effect work, I place a highlight and then I check if the angle is working on it. Placing, checking, placing, checking. I do this throughout the whole process because it's quite frustrating when you think you are done with your mini and take some pictures, and all of a sudden these highlights don't work as much as you thought they would. So always double check your work for better results. You may notice that both this blue and neutral gray highlights are quite desaturated. This is another thing when painting black. You need desaturated colors to paint it. If you have some very saturated OSL effect like warm yellow candlelight or some vibrant greens with some toxic goo glowing next to your black subject, then it's a different case, but usually you need desaturated tones to highlight any black surface. The level of values regarding how bright or dark the paints you use for that is depending on what you are painting. For example, the coat is shinier than the pants, so you don't need the same values as I mentioned before. So let's make a recap about black. You need to have a bigger part of your subject to be black compared to your highlights. So your mid-tone will read as black. You can paint black using different tones like cold and dark blues, greens, purples, or even some dark reds could work. But you need to desaturate these as you go higher in value, making them more gray. And of course, you can use only black and white and a mixture of the two, but it will lack any tonal variation and will be generally more boring looking. So that's it guys, I hope this video was useful, and as always, a huge thanks to my patrons for their support. If you guys are interested in more Marvel Zombies or Massive Darkness 2 PDF guides and full-length video guides, consider joining my Patreon page. And a special shout out goes to Cold-Blooded Dom, Trying to Paint Minis, Jonathan Mausner, Glitchy McCrash, Penoman45 and Michael Kerr. I hope your day will be as smooth as a granny's butt cheek.